Hello, welcome to the Holy Human Project. My name is Omar Regalado, and today we will be continuing the series about the different layers that make up your invisible ecology, as I've been calling it. And these four layers are part of what I call a framing approach, which make up the Holy Human Project. These four layers are your personal story, your psychology, your soul, and your mission. And through these four foundational layers, your core layers, you can develop a way to gain self-knowledge and bring understanding about yourself and enhance and promote a sense of integration and wholeness in your life. So this is a way to frame the different areas of your life and bring them together. So today we will be focusing on the layer of psychology. So with that said, as you may know, psychology is a very intimidating topic. I think that it can be very deep, it's complex, I think it's vast, and this can lead to a lot of confusion and not to mention that there are so many things that we still don't know. Science has not gotten to how many issues about our minds work. But overall, I believe that in essence, the way to oversimplify psychology is to see how this is where our mind meets our emotions. So it's definitely way more than that, but this is at the core, the root of it, how our mind and emotions converge. And this happens in various ways, and we will be covering that a little bit in this video. But that is how I think it's important to start framing psychology. This dual, it has this dual element, this duality, mind and emotions, and then how we relate to that duality and how we behave and adjust around that. But before we go into psychology, I want to comment on something that I think is worth clarifying. And psychology, as we will be covering in the Holy Human Project, is about learning how your mind works, learning about different elements that make up the way you think, the way you behave, and the way you perceive things. And this is not related to mental health. I believe that throughout history, the way the field of psychology had developed, it basically follows a very similar pattern to the way medicine developed, that we started learning all about illnesses and what was wrong with us and all these different pathologies. But medicine and psychology as well, over time started, finding out, well, we know how to deal with illnesses, or we know how to deal when something goes wrong with the body or with our minds, but we may not be completely clear on what makes a healthy human being, both in terms of physical wellness and mental health. So this is where a few decades ago, in the field of psychology at least, humanistic psychology started basically questioning this. We know how a lot of problems arise when it comes to our minds, and we definitely have mapped out a lot of problems and pathologies. And this is the field of mental health. This is the space of mental health. But what about a normal human being, a person that is well, that doesn't have any mental health problems, or if that person doesn't exist, how would that person look like? So humanistic psychology basically started asking these questions along with other schools of psychology. But among those humanistic psychologists, Abraham Maslow was one of them. And he basically started developing observations and different research projects around, how do humans look if everything is well? What are the conditions that make a human feel like they're thriving, and many other considerations. But this is something that I wanted you to be aware of before we move on. Mental health is one thing. Psychology and all this psychological literacy is a different thing. The Holy Human Project will be focusing mostly on psychological literacy, and even though this is a daunting process and journey in many ways, we do have enough knowledge to really navigate our psychology, and that's the idea. So with that out of the way, making it clear that we will be focusing about psychology and we will be leaving on the side completely any mental health elements, we can now start, okay, engaging with how to go about our psychology. And right as I mentioned Abraham Maslow, there's a recent author called Scott Barry Kaufman that has been revisiting a lot of the unpublished research from Abraham Maslow. And this research revolves mostly around human needs. And back in the different projects and findings from Abraham Maslow, he developed this hierarchy of needs. You may have seen this pyramid, and he never actually drew a pyramid about that, so it's a funny fact. But overall, they are usually framed as if they are really like levels and one stack on top of each other. And that's not really the case. These needs are definitely dynamic. They form a system. And overall, the way Scott Barry Kaufman frames these needs are, he basically groups them in two groups. As you may be able to see, in this picture, he uses a boat, and those two groups of needs are the security needs and the growth needs. If we use a boat, in the hull of the boat will include the needs of safety, connection, and self-esteem. And when we have that, we are secure. We have that strong foundation and we can navigate life. When we have those, then we need to go somewhere, right? We need some direction, and then we can have our growth needs met. And those growth needs include exploration, love, and purpose. So basically, these can't really come alive if we lack security. And also within the security needs, there are different elements that interact. And then, if we are a self-actualized person, we can aim for transcendence. And so this is basically like a core psychological framework in which you can start at the very least, connecting the dots on how your life, how your story, how your environment can relate to all of these needs. And this informs back to the basic element that I mentioned earlier, or on your mind and emotions, and how well your human needs have been met or fulfilled throughout your life is like a very strong indication of how your psychology will be, like the shape of your psychology, so to speak. So with that in mind, basically we can propose, or we can consider that if your human needs have been met, you will develop certain behaviors and certain character traits that will look in a certain way, right? But if you have not had your human needs met, and let's say you have not had security, and then different elements led to have let's say a poor sense of self-esteem, for example, or you couldn't really connect well with others, then this will lead for you to develop coping mechanisms. So these coping mechanisms will basically try to get you to fulfill those needs. And sometimes when that still doesn't happen, then you can have maladaptive coping mechanism that basically becomes like substitutes for those needs. Those maladaptive coping mechanisms include addictions, and different compulsions. And so through this lens of the human needs and how they were met, or they are not being met, maybe you had them throughout your life, or maybe you go through a crisis when your needs actually become compromised, then you can see the needs and your coping mechanisms, how they really operate, and you will always see that the mind and emotions are there. Thoughts, emotions will be across your behavior and your the way you engage with the world throughout the fulfillment of your needs. So this is something that I think is foundational as a way to understand how to go about our psychology, the framing of the human needs. And this is something that is always active. We can always assess where we are and where we fall in any of these needs. And maybe we can also assess where we want to be according to this framework. So once we have that, we can also consider different elements that may and may not be related to your needs, but they are also undeniable when it comes to our psychology. And we can consider your personality, your different elements, around that personality, the way you communicate, the way others perceive you, and the way you can connect and relate. Again, it overlaps with your needs, but your personality is really, a way in which you can operate with others and connect with others, and become a part of a group. And so within a group, for example, your personality and the different elements of your psychology will lead you to performing well in certain roles, or maybe find yourself drawn to other roles, or maybe sometimes you don't even like them, but you find yourself repeating patterns in which you fulfill certain role within a group or a system, right? And so between your personality, the roles in which you engage with others, then you will always have a set of beliefs. So these all connect and interact with the way your human needs were met. Your personality, your the roles you play, the roles that you have in different groups, your family, or maybe your workplace, or with your friends, or different groups in general, and all of that will inform beliefs. And this is not like a one-way street, it's like a two-way street, and maybe like a multiple ways to connect and interact with each other. But these are kind of like, again, more building blocks into your psychology. We can read a lot of it through our human needs, but then we can see it in action by how we perceive and read our personality, the roles that we have, and then the beliefs that inform and kind of sustain all of that, the personality, how we strive to fulfill our needs, or how to keep our roles, like kind of functioning in the groups that we have. So this is basically like a very fundamental understanding of your psychology. So this is the way that we will be covering, the psychology here. But we cannot be done about this layer without mentioning trauma. So trauma is really like this elephant in the room when it comes to psychology, and there are different implications about trauma, and maybe back to the needs, if you didn't have safety growing up, then there will be different elements connected to trauma that will compromise the way you can connect with others, that will definitely inform your personality, that will most definitely kind of like condition the roles you can play in different groups, and also will most definitely stay somehow in place through your beliefs. So trauma can have a lot of side effects. It can condition in many ways our behavior, and it really deserves like special attention when it comes to our psychology. But also, I don't think that it's so special that it needs to be considered independently of the rest of the aspects that make psychology, this layer functional. So I think it's important always to think in systems, and I think that trauma can really be something that compromises this whole layer, and it can definitely spill over other layers. But on its own, I think that it can be critical, it can be definitely, like essential to address. But, there are definitely factors and elements that override or can go, beyond any traumatic response, right? So trauma has to be considered. That's why I, gave it, a few minutes, because, you can't really have a full picture of your psychology without it. But now let's close this video with how a person that, has its psychology, kind of, all rounded and together looks like. And basically this goes back to emotions. And we are somehow familiar with the idea of emotional intelligence. And but I also want to introduce today emotional maturity. I believe that emotional intelligence is critical and it's a great skill to have. But this is basically about being skill at reading and knowing how you're feeling, naming your emotions, and then regulating them. So it's a lot about managing your emotions, right? But then emotional maturity really has to do with a person that is composed, that, you know, even when they are, let's say, upset or distraught or going through serious difficulties, they can assess themselves, they can, you know, keep themselves composed, they can remain objectivity and perspective, they can communicate that, they can respond and you know, in ways that are respectful, for example, with others, they can hold themselves accountable, they can really, you know, communicate what they're going through without, you know, going into, you know, a lot of like, you know, flooding themselves with emotion or any victim mindset, for example. And they can follow through, you know, despite emotions, despite challenges. So emotional maturity is really that kind of like a sense of personal development, so to speak, that you gain when your psychological layer is handled properly. So that's kind of like the goal. That's how a person looks like when their psychological layer is, you know, in good shape. And so that's how I wanted to close today. You know, emotional intelligence is important, but only if that really leads and informs emotional maturity. And that's how, you know, you can kind of tell that you are on the right track when it comes to your psychological layer. So that's what I have for you today. And in the next video, I will be sharing all about the layer of your soul. So that is another element that I think is very important that I want to bring clarity through the Holy Human Project, because I think spirituality is very, very confusing in many ways, just like psychology. And I think that this overlap between psychological literacy and spiritual literacy can be very informative and can enrich your life in many ways. So make sure you keep an eye for that video. And as usual, you know the drill. Feel free to like and subscribe to the channel if you like what you're listening to here. And I also publish content regularly on Substack if you want to follow what I publish there. And if any of this resonates with you, or if you have any questions or you would like to connect, just feel free to comment, feel free to connect in any way you want, and I'll be more than happy to get back to you. So hope you enjoyed this, and we'll be back in touch soon. Bye bye.